Hey everyone, and welcome to our first content module, Module 2, for your Rehab 600 class. I'm very excited to be digging into these first content modules because, as I mentioned in my introductory video, they're very historically focused, okay? So it's going to feel like a history class, but a history of counseling and rehabilitation counseling. So hopefully it'll be a little bit more entertaining, I don't know, fun, if you will. The first law, if you will, that we're going to be talking about is the Rehabilitation Act. And I provided a number of different resources for you on the Rehab Act. In terms of the most meaningful and impactful disability-related legislation, the Rehab Act of 1973 is at the top, okay? And we also have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which came in 1990, so there's a pretty good gap in between the two. And Module 4, we're going to be talking about the Rehabilitation Act in addition to other pieces of legislation. But we have to be starting out talking about the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 because it made such a difference in the lives of individuals with disabilities across the United States of America. In the lecture notes, you'll see that I've mentioned other older rehabilitation counseling related laws. I'm not going to go into depth with each of those for this module, but I will say, and you'll notice this with me as I do these video lectures, it's a benefit to watch them because I give you little hints. Those laws will be on exams, okay? My exams and the CRC exam if you opt to take that at the end of the program. So be familiar with the older pieces of legislation that related to individuals with disabilities being afforded the opportunities to engage in work in some form or fashion. So the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was a long time coming. 1973 seems like a long time ago. It really wasn't in the grander scheme of things. And prior to the Rehab Act, there really wasn't much protecting individuals with disabilities, okay? So meaning that workplaces weren't accessible. Not only were workplaces not accessible, but employers prior to the Rehab Act within this federal system could basically say, I'm not employing you simply because you have a disability. So people with disabilities were just actively being discriminated against in all facets of life. And so we saw in the 1970s, of course, with the civil rights movement, that extended on to the disability populations. And so the civil rights movements in the 60s really gave a group of individuals with disabilities kind of an idea or structure of how to impart change on a political level, okay? So the civil rights movement, the sit-ins, going to Washington, talking with legislators, getting laws put into place, all that was done, at the back end of that in the civil rights movement, the disability rights movement used all of that and helped to push forward this legislation. So it applies to, this is the main, one of the biggest differences between the Rehabilitation Act, which is still in existence. It's been amended a number of different times, continues to be amended, changes continue to be made to these laws. So it doesn't look exactly like it did in 1973, obviously. But the biggest difference between the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act is that the Rehabilitation Act, and if you know one thing about these two different laws, okay, this is incredibly important. The Rehab Act applies to the federal government, okay? It applies to federal employees, federal contractors, programs that are sponsored or paid for by the federal government, programs that are paid partially by the federal government. So the Rehab Act is where all of our state vocational rehabilitation counseling agencies come from, right? It is where we hear about 504 plans in the school systems. It's where we are now learning more about transition services and pre-eds and how our voc rehab counselors are getting into the schools in a more dedicated way and working with youth and students with disabilities so that they are able to transition ideally seamlessly from that structured high school environment either to secondary education settings, continued like vocational education or employment settings. So The Rehabilitation Act is why we can log on to any .gov site and that website is accessible. So there are a number of things that have spurred from the Rehabilitation Act, but the main thing to think about is the Rehab Act applies to the federal government. The Americans with Disabilities Act applies to the private sector. So if we're kind of jumping ahead and understanding these two big major pieces of legislation, the Rehab Act made all of these impactful changes within the federal agencies, the federal government, public facilities, but then at the end of the day, private entities were not being held to any kind of standard. They to make accommodations for employees, to make accommodations for patrons, for customers. And so we saw from 1973 to 1990 the same type of political activism that was necessary in order for George Bush Sr. to sign the ADA in 1990. So that's, you know, a little bit further than I wanted to go with the ADA, but I think it's useful for you to be able to, well, necessary for you to be able to differentiate between the two. So with the Rehab Act of 1973 and all the amendments that have come afterwards, you know, the 5 major mandates of the Rehab Act are: 1, serving individuals with severe disabilities, and we're going to see that type of language throughout. We're wanting to promote consumer involvement in federal agencies, in federal employment, in public services. Program evaluation is a huge piece of that. You're going to learn about program evaluation in, of course, your research class. But basically that means that agencies need to report back to whoever the higher federal entity is to make sure that they're actually providing services, that they're actually hiring individuals with disabilities at the rates that they need to be hiring individuals with disabilities. There's support for research under the Rehabilitation Act and funding for that as well. And of course, advancing the civil rights of individuals with disabilities. So the Rehab Act is basically a non-discrimination piece of legislation, right? In the hiring practices of the federal government, in accessibility of federal buildings, in some of the older videos that I don't think all of the videos I put on, there are lots of different videos about the disability rights movement. You're going to see them throughout the course, but one of the most memorable points of the Rehab Act, or getting the Rehab Act signed into place, was something called the Capitol Crawl. And basically, a group of individuals with disabilities came to the Capitol, in the capital of the United States, in D.C., right? The Capitol building, and to make the point that they were not even able to access the facility, the United States Capitol. Individuals got themselves out of their wheelchairs and literally climbed up to the best of their abilities without any assistance, climbed up the stairs of the Capitol to make the point that they, as U.S. citizens, as Americans, were not even able to access, you know, the highest seat in the House, right? The highest center of legislation where the laws were made. And so there were a lot of these types of movements throughout the country, and we saw that. And you can watch YouTube videos on it. A lot of them are really not only interesting, but I think they really put a face to the movement and make it a lot easier for us to understand why it was so necessary that these kind of peaceful protests were done in order to get the Rehab Act signed. So the Rehab Act has different sections. Again, very important. Every law has all these different sections, right? That's pretty typical. The Rehab Act has a number of them. I put some additional resources on each section of the Rehab Act in another content folder in the module, so I do want you to go through and familiarize yourself with each of the sections of the Rehab Act. It will be useful for you as you move forward in the class and even in the discussion posts, because each section of the Rehab Act is a little bit different. It focuses on different things. Sections 501 and 505 prohibit employment discrimination in the federal government, and so that's been one that's been, of course, extremely impactful. The federal government essentially regards themselves as the model employer in terms of affirmative action. So, you know, to have these laws in place for such a long period of time, they have a number of policies and procedures into place for individuals that need accommodations to be requesting them when they're federal employees. They have EEO officers, dispute resolution persons that people can go to when they feel like they're being discriminated discriminated against, and they have their own timelines, deadlines for supervisors to respond to accommodation requests, and ways that employees that work for the federal government can file grievances and complaints against that agency if they feel like they've been discriminated against. Section 503 is related to federal contractors, and both within the sections 501 and 504 or 503, sorry, getting ahead of myself here, 501 and 503, more recent legislation has required federal employers to report how many individuals with disabilities are actually working for them. Because what the federal government was finding, again through the reporting, through the program evaluation process of all of it, was that they had these policies in place where they were, mandated to hire people with disabilities, make accommodations so they can retain individuals with disabilities in the workforce, but they really weren't hiring that many people with disabilities. And so now if, let's say, you're filling out an application on USA Jobs, you'll see like the voluntary disclosure forms where you can say yes or no if you have a disability, or no, I don't want to say one way or the other. And so the federal agencies now have to report the number of people that they've actually employed, actually made job offers to, and they've done a good job more recently even surveying current employees to figure out if they're meeting the threshold, if they're meeting the standard. So that's more recent legislation. 504, like I said, applies largely to participation in any kind of program or activity that receives federal funding. And this is where we see the school systems come into play, right? And so when you think of 504 plans for students with disabilities that need to have accommodations in the school systems, and that's where Section 504 of the Rehab Act can be seen, I would say, most frequently for those of us in the mental health counseling profession. Section 508, like I said, applies to electronic information, and certainly what we think of now in 2020 is different than what they intended, I would say, in 1973, and so that's one where we've seen some modifications and amendments as well. More recently, with the Rehab Act, we've seen in 2014 a total kind of reform of an old piece of legislation, and now we're looking at the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA, WIOA, and for those of us that are working in the more traditional public VR system, this was largely impactful, right? You all know that in terms of reporting, how services are being provided, resources that are being allocated to students and youth with disabilities in the school systems, and pre-ETS work. And so this is where we see a more recent change in the structure of our state VR programs, where there's a greater emphasis on working with students with disabilities in the school systems. So the transition process is kind of that's the formal term for working with students that are within IEP programs, right, receiving some type of accommodation within the school systems. Maybe they have a 504 plan, maybe they're under IDEA, whatever it might be. We're seeing that basically, kind of boiling this down and simplifying it, that there's a transition process. So VR counselors are supposed to be sitting in on IEP team meetings, and working with the students earlier on to make sure that if they're eligible for VR services, if they're able to kind of transition nicely into the VR system right after they have graduated or aged out of the public education system, that they're able to do that, and really kind of making a point that that students with disabilities, just because the educational opportunities in public ed, K through 12 has ended, that doesn't mean that there's nothing out there for those students afterwards. So whether it be work, whether it be going into a vocational program, or whether it be going into post-secondary education, VR counselors are now kind of mandated, and there's funds to do that and funds allocated for that, so that these students aren't getting left behind. A lot of other notable events happened before the 2000s, and I know that we're looking a long time back here, right? Because that was, even 2000 was 20 years ago. And we will learn about these in more detail as we move along in the semester. But there's the independent living movement, lots of pieces of legislation that relate to individuals with developmental disabilities, a lot of pieces of legislation that relate to students with disabilities, students being, those that are younger than 21 years of age, essentially, and of course, Social Security Disability Insurance, which is different than SSI. And a lot of that can be very confusing, and so we'll be spending some time focusing on that as we move along. So this was just, again, a nice little introduction into the Rehabilitation Act. A lot of the legwork that you'll do in understanding the law is going to come through some of the resource materials that are provided in the content folder for Module 2. And then, of course, we have a discussion for this week. So with that, I'll let you guys get back to reading. If you have any questions, just post them on the discussion board, okay? Thanks.